Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today for lunch. I'm really very pleased to see the turnout that we have for this briefing today at lunchtime on population in California. And I just wanted to say that you all made a great choice to be here because you are going to be hearing from the leading expert at PPIC on population issues and one of the leading experts in the country on the much quoted, often cited, and one of the most prolific researchers that we have at PPIC, Hans Johnson, who it's my pleasure to introduce today because he has been a good friend and colleague for many, many years. He's a senior fellow, a Bren Fellow. He's our co-director of research, so he wears a lot of hats at PPIC. I know that you'll all leave here well informed about population, which, after all, population is part of our destiny in California, a very important part of our program to inform you all about planning for California's future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend, Hans Johnson.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Dave, and thanks to everyone for coming to a talk on California's population. I'm a little overwhelmed. You know, demography doesn't usually draw this kind of crowd. So I know there are a number of demographers here from the Department of Finance, and I rely on their good work quite a bit, so I appreciate their attendance here too. A few years ago, PPIC began a series of studies that we call California 2025. And just as the name implies, the focus of that work is on California's long-term future. And when you think about California's long-term future, of course, you have to think about and understand population and how population change is going to influence that future. I think it's only a bit of an overstatement to claim that demography drives destiny or that demography drives policy in California. Certainly, we could think of a number of different ways that demography influences policy. There have been, for example, some well-known what have been called wedge issues in our statewide propositions that really are, I think, in many ways a consequence of or a response to population and population change in California. And we'll get to that at the end of the talk. There's also maybe a more immediate way that population drives policy and governance issue, and that is that population change to a very large extent determine demand for government services, determine caseloads, whether it's in things like electricity, water consumption, criminal justice, certainly in education. The demography of California is a key driver. And then maybe most importantly, the population of the state and the changing nature of that population have a lot to do with politics and political representation in California. So certainly we all know that the censuses are used to apportion the House of Representatives, for example, which is, of course, a very direct measure of California's political power, which derives, obviously, from its population. So what I'd like to do in this talk is give you an overview of California's population and how it's changing. So first of all, we'll talk about California's population growth. Then we'll talk about diversity and the complexity of California's population. And then finally, we'll touch on some implications for public policy. There's going to be a lot of charts and numbers. I'm a demographer after all. And I think though these charts and numbers tell a pretty fascinating story. For a demographer, I would say there is no other place in the world that is as fascinating as California to work in. Now, it might be a low bar for something to fascinate a demographer. I've been told that demographers are people who would have been accountants, but they lack the personality. And you're laughing at my jokes, which show that you have a very low entertainment threshold as well. But I think that at the end of this talk, my goal is that you'll share some of the enthusiasm I have for California and California's demography, and you'll see some of the ways that California really is remarkable. So one of the most remarkable features of California has been the sustained population growth that we have seen decade after decade after decade. So this chart shows the state's population from 1900 through to the most current year we have data for, 2012. And you'll see that the line is very strongly upward sloping. As recently as 1970, California was home to about 20 million people. Today, California is home to almost 40 million people, so a doubling in a relatively short amount of time. Now, to give you a context for how remarkable this growth has been, what I've done is created this population index. So population of different places here, I'm going to show you California in a second, but I'm showing you right now Mexico and the United States is indexed to 100 in 1910. And what that means, for example, for the United States, you see the line goes up somewhat to about 338. So for every 100 people in California in 1910, there are about 330 people in the United States today. So that's a growth of about threefold. For Mexico, which has had growth that's much more typical of a less developed country, for every 100 people in 1910, there are 700 people in Mexico today. So Mexico's population has gone up sevenfold over this time frame. Now, of course, Mexico started out at a much lower base, so it doesn't have as many people as the United States, but this gives you a kind of good way to measure how growth has changed these places over time. And realize, too, that the United States, for a developed region of the world, actually has fairly rapid growth rates compared to many other developed regions of the world. In many cases, countries are experiencing outright population decline even right now. Some countries in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Japan in particular. So now let's look at how California compares. Okay, so there were even oohs and ahs to a demography chart. This keeps getting better. So California has almost 16 times as many people today as we did in 1910. So this is really remarkable. Again, no other developed region of the world that is the size of California has sustained this kind of population growth decade after decade after decade. Now, having said all that, growth in California has slowed recently. And there are different ways that we could measure growth. Here I'm showing you the percent increase in each decade from the 1950s through to the first decade of the 2000s, comparing California and the United States. And there are a couple things to note here. First, California, up through and even including the 1990s, has consistently outpaced the United States in terms of growth rates. But the size of those bars is going down, meaning that the growth rates have been going down in California. In the 2000s, which is from 2000 to 2010, California experienced the same growth rate as the United States as a whole. So our population increased 10% in this most recent decade. That meant that for the first time ever, with one exception that I'll mention in a second, California did not gain any new members in the House of Representatives. So, of course, the House of Representatives is divvied up based on your share of the population. Our share didn't change, so we didn't get any new members between 2000 and 2010. Contrast that with the period from the 1950s through to the 1990s, when in 1950 we had 23 members in the House of Representatives in Washington. By 2000, that number had grown to 53 because our population was growing so fast. The only other decade in which there was no reapportionment of the House of Representatives was actually in 1920. It's an interesting historical side note. California was growing fast between 1910 and 1920 and should have gotten more members. But the entire population of the United States was changing in ways that meant that rural legislators were losing power, or would have if there had been reapportionment, and urban areas of the United States were growing very rapidly and would have gained a lot of power, and rural legislators across the United States were able to fight reapportionment from happening in 1920, so there was actually no reapportionment. Okay, so why is California's population growing? Well, there are only three ways that a population can change over time. Those are births, deaths, and migration. And the difference between births and deaths we call natural increase, which is in the orange bars here. And then the difference between the number of people moving in and the number of people moving out is net migration. And we've broken migration out into two different components. Domestic migration, that is migration between California and other states, and then international immigration, which of course is immigration between California and other countries. And these numbers are produced by the Department of Finance. The Census Bureau has some similar figures, slightly different patterns, but pretty consistent. And what you'll see is that there's been a change, especially with respect to the flows of domestic migrants, that is, people moving to and from California from other states. So you'll see in this very first bar, it's actually positive. This total, the scale here is in millions. So that between 1999 and 2000, California gained almost 600,000 people. And over 100,000 of that was because of more people moving here from other states than moving from California to other states. And you'll see that was the last year in over 10 years in which we've seen a positive flow of people from other states to California. It's also, I think, really noteworthy, and you should keep in mind that is actually more typical of California's long-term demographic history. Certainly there have been ebbs and flows in domestic migration to California, but the long-term demographic history of California, this period when we gained so many people in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 1980s, a lot of that migration was coming from other states. We're clearly in a very different pattern now and have been for some sustained period of time. And there's a real question how long we will stay in this pattern, or if this has become the new permanent demography of California, with more people leaving than people coming in. There are other states that have gone through this kind of transformation. So New York, for example, has gone through this. In the case of New York, they have more people leaving through domestic migration than they have coming in internationally, so they actually have migration losses overall. In California, you'll see that the size of the brown bars, foreign immigration, has kept total migration positive for most years, but not for all. And in fact, for a number of years now, we've actually been losing in terms of overall migration as well. So this is a big change for our state. The Department of Finance has just released some new population projections, which show that continued growth is projected. And when we look at this in terms of absolute amounts, we're talking about sizable numbers. So for example, between 2010 and 2020, the projection is that California will add over 3 million people, which is over 300,000 a year, almost 1,000 people a day. That's pretty strong, robust growth. But when we look at it in percentage terms, these are very low growth rates are implied by these numbers. So we're growing by less than 10% a decade. And if you'll remember the chart I just showed you, we've never had a decade when we've grown by less than 10%. So our growth really has slowed, but it's still important to keep in mind that doesn't mean that we aren't adding a lot of people. And then finally, where is that growth going to occur? For quite a while now, inland counties have been growing faster than coastal counties. The projections are that those inland counties will continue to have faster growth rates. Some of the fastest growth rates will be in some of the counties around the Sacramento region, but the general pattern is slower growth in the coast and faster growth inland. Okay, so now let's talk about the diversity and complexity of California's population. So as recently as 1970, about 80% of the state's residents were non-Hispanic white, about 12% were Latino. By 2000, there was no racial or ethnic group that constituted a majority of the state's population. Non-Hispanic whites were still the largest group, but they were no longer more than 50% of the state's population. And there were only 2 other states that had preceded California in this designation as being majority-minority states. Can anyone guess? Hawaii, that's good. Arizona, no. New Mexico, right. So you guys are good. Most people don't get the New Mexico one. And in any event, I would argue that California has a much more diverse population than either one of those states. So Hawaii, of course, has a very large Asian and Pacific Islander population, but very low Latino and African American populations. New Mexico has a very large American Indian and Latino population, but a very low Asian population. And California has sizable proportions of every one of those groups. The 2010 census found that Latinos were rapidly approaching whites as one of the largest groups. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the racial and ethnic categories that we use have changed over time. And in fact, there have only been 2 censuses when they were completely consistent with each other. That was the 2000 and 2010 censuses. And so the categories that we use now probably aren't going to be the categories that we use in the future. Here I'm showing you the 2 census and also the American Community Survey, which is a very important source of information. If there are questions about how and where we get this information, we could talk about that at the end. But both of those primary sources of information come from the federal government, from the Census Bureau. And they asked two questions on race and ethnicity. The first question is the ethnicity question, but really it's the Latino question, which is, are you Latino or not? And then the second question is what is your race? And deciding how to ask these questions is actually quite politically controversial. So for example, prior to the 2000 census, it's the Office of Management and Budget that determines what the racial and ethnic categories are going to be. And there was a large protest in Washington, D.C. on the Mall of 50,000 people who were arguing that there should be a multiracial checkoff box in the 2000 census. I mean, imagine that, 50,000 people protesting on a census question. The reason they're doing that is because partly they felt like they didn't have a place for themselves in the census. In the past, for example, in 1990, if someone checked that they were both black and white, the Census Bureau would have redesignated them as either black or white based on an algorithm they had, but would not allow both of those boxes to be checked. As a result of that protest and hearings and discussions, OMB decided that people should be allowed to check more than one box. So there isn't a multiracial checkoff box, but you'll see here in number 9, it's maybe hard to see, but it says at the very top there, mark one or more boxes. So that wasn't allowed before. Now people mark one or more boxes, and we have this multiracial category that we can tabulate. That's a reflection of people's changing identity, but also when the Census Bureau starts asking questions, it can also lead to further changes. There was another group prior to the 2000 census that argued for a checkoff box. Those were Arab Americans, who most commonly will be categorized as white. If they wrote something in like Arab American, probably they're going to get redesignated as white. OMB determined that there weren't sufficient numbers of Arab Americans to provide a checkoff box for Arab Americans, so they didn't get a box. Native Hawaiians wanted to be included with American Indians rather than as Pacific Islanders. There were program reasons why they might have wanted that, and also kind of recognition as an indigenous group in America, and some land claims that have been made that I think were probably a part of the thinking about being identified as an indigenous or American Indian. Native Hawaiians didn't win that battle, so they got their own box, but they didn't get to be included as American Indians. Okay, so what's driving these racial and ethnic changes that we've seen? As I've mentioned, there are only 3 ways a population can change, and clearly a lot of the increase in diversity that we've seen in California has been a consequence of our increasing immigration from abroad. So immigration directly, of course, changes the population, and then as immigrants have families and children, that leads to continued change. There's 3 things I'd really like you to notice in this chart. First, this shows the percent of California in the United States population that is comprised of immigrants from 1870 all the way through to 2010. And the first thing to notice is that California has always had more immigrants than the rest of the country. We are the primary destination of immigrants coming to the United States, not a majority, but the largest single share of immigrants come to California compared to any other state. The second thing to notice is that this period from about 1940 to 1970, which many baby boomers like me think of as kind of normative. That's when we grew up in California. That's the kind of California we think about, was actually very unusual in that only less than 10% of the state's population was made up of immigrants during that time frame. And then the next thing I'd like you to realize is that the percent of immigrants in our population has gone up quite a bit in the last few decades. It's slowed a little bit. The increase has slowed a little bit between 2000 and 2010. But is much more consistent with our long-term demographic history as a state. So we're at levels now that we haven't seen since about 1890, and is really kind of representative of the long-term demographic history of our state rather than that period from 1940 to 1970. So where do most of the immigrants come from? Well, 90%, almost 90% come from either Latin America or Asia, but there are large numbers from the rest of the world as well. There's been a really interesting recent change in the source of origin of immigrants to California, with Asia now surpassing the flow from Latin America, so that this chart, which shows the number of immigrants arriving each year from 2004 through to the most recent year, 2010-11, shows a decline in immigrants arriving in California from Latin America, pretty substantial decline. and a pretty notable increase in the share coming from Asia, so that now there are over twice as many immigrants arriving in California from Asia than from Latin America. And that's a very dramatic departure of not only just over this period, but compared to our long-term historical numbers that I just showed you. So where do immigrants come from? Well, there's going to be a test here, so you guys have to memorize this. You have about 2 minutes. Obviously, this is not meant for you to read all these countries. It's meant to give you a sense of the diversity of California's population. So there are over 60 different countries here that have contributed at least 10,000 immigrants to California. So to get on this list, you had to have at least 10,000. And it starts with the leading country of origin of immigrants, which of course is Mexico, then comes Philippines and China, so reading across. But even Tonga, at the very bottom here, has 10,000, over 10,000 immigrants in California. Tonga is a very small South Pacific island nation, set of island nations. Tonga has 100,000 people in Tonga. So that about 10% of the Tongan population lives in California. And this is one, I'm just going to go through this example because to me it just illustrates the richness and diversity of our state. So a lot of Tongans in California live on the peninsula, south of San Francisco. They live there partly and largely because the king of Tonga established a royal residence in Hillsborough, which is a very wealthy enclave south of San Francisco. And that served as a locus for the Tongan community in settling in the United States and became a point of information and friends and relatives who served as avenues for people to move into the United States. And every now and then you'll see some newspaper story in one of the local newspapers about neighbors complaining about parties in Hillsborough at the royal residence of the Tongan king. And Hillsborough being a very quiet, staid community, it's just kind of, to me, a very interesting contrast between maybe old California and a newer California. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, the Department of Finance projections just released showed a continuing increase in the Latino population of the state. I think sometime in the next year or so, Latinos will become the single largest group in California, but not reach a majority, and not even by 2060 reaching a majority, but will again become the largest group. The Asian and African American populations are projected to remain fairly constant in terms of their share of the state's total. Okay, so we're doing fine in terms of time. So what does all this mean for policy? Well, as I said, I think there are 3 different ways to think about population and policy. And one are what have been called wedge issues. And they've been called wedge issues because they really divide the population many times on the basis of race and ethnicity. And in California, we could think of at least 4 different statewide propositions we've had that have, I think, been pretty directly tied to our changing population. So Proposition 187 in 1994, how many of you know what that is? Okay, just about a third. So Proposition 187 in 1994 would have banned providing any government services, including education, to illegal or unauthorized immigrants. That proposition passed by a pretty wide margin. It was subsequently primarily ruled by the courts in California to be illegal. So there were some provisions of that ban that remain, of that proposition that remained, but the major ones were ruled unconstitutional. For example, not providing education to illegal immigrant children. Proposition 209 in 1996 banned affirmative action for the purposes of state employment and for selection into our state's colleges and universities. That passed and is enforced. Proposition 227 in 1998 was designed to eliminate bilingual education in our schools, and it passed, and there was a big change in bilingual education after that. And then finally we got to 2003 and Proposition 54, which was the first of what I would call these wedge issues that failed in California. Proposition 54 would have banned the state from collecting racial and ethnic data. And it failed. That one was sponsored by Ward Connerly, who had also been behind the affirmative action and some other initiatives trying to prevent the state from using racial and ethnic data. I think that this history of these statewide propositions, as I said, really was a reflection of the times. The state's population was changing dramatically. When Proposition 187 passed, for example, there were commercials that ran that showed the border at San Ysidro where the cars come across, and grainy footage of actual waves of immigrants running across. So one of the strategies that some unauthorized immigrants had used would they'd congregate on the Mexican side and then run across en masse, knowing that the Border Patrol couldn't catch them all. So they ran those grainy footages, and the commentary was, they just keep coming, they just keep coming, they just keep coming. It passed, and I think, again, was a kind of reflection of the voting Californians' concerns about how the state was changing. Today, PPIC has just conducted a statewide survey that has asked adults in our state what they think about immigration and immigration reform, and I'd say we're in a very different place, and realize that not since 1998 have we had one of these wedge issues pass in our state on the statewide proposition. In our latest survey, we asked residents of California whether they thought that immigrants who had lived and worked in California for 2 years should be able, or in the United States for 2 years, should be able to gain a legal path towards citizenship. And we had a record high percentage, 76% of Californians saying that they thought they should be able to do so. We also asked Californians whether they think immigrants are a benefit or a burden. And again, we had a record high percentage, 62%, saying that they thought immigrants were a benefit. So this is a real change in Californians' attitudes. And realize that these changes in attitudes are coming at a time when our economy is not particularly robust, too. It's often the case that when the economy goes south, attitudes towards immigration get more opposed, but it doesn't seem to be the case right now. The other way that demography drives policy, I think, is clearly it changes voters, who the voters are. In the most recent presidential election, of course, we heard a lot of discussion after the election about the rise of the Latino electorate, what that meant for the election, and how important that was to President Obama in terms of him getting elected. And we've seen a response, a policy response in Congress now, where comprehensive immigration reform is being discussed. On NPR on the way over this morning, the commentator said that that was the only policy suggestion by the president in which both sides of the aisle stood up and clapped. I don't know if that's true. I didn't actually see the TV coverage. But I think, again, here we see how demography in the rest of the United States is starting to change some of the discussion there. The rest of the United States, of course, lags California by quite a bit in terms of these demographic changes. And then finally, as I said, I think programs and caseloads are clearly affected by not only changes in the population, but by changes in the composition of the population. Here's perhaps the most immediate and obvious one. We could look at the changes in the population by age. And so here the gold line are for seniors, that is people age 65 and over. These are the Department of Finance projections for 2010 to 2060. And then you'll see the blue line is the population of children. And in many ways, this is kind of good news. The largest source of expenditures in our state budget are for K-12 education. We have a bit of breathing room over the next few decades in terms of relatively modest growth in that population. If we looked historically, you'd see very sharp growth in the number of children. So this should, all else equal, make it easier to provide services, in this case education, to our children. On the other hand, certainly well known and discussed in Washington quite a bit is the increase in the senior population. This is driven by the very large cohort of the baby boom, which is already starting to hit retirement years. You'll see that the projection is that somewhere around 2040, the number of seniors in California will surpass the number of children in our state. The federal government, of course, provides Medicare and Social Security, but in California, a substantial share of Medi-Cal funding, Medicaid, goes to seniors in nursing homes. So this does have important implications for the state from a healthcare perspective, but also other kinds of issues like transportation for seniors and things like that. When we think about how this changing population impacts other issues like voting and political representation, in some ways we might say, well, this changing ethnic mix in California doesn't mean much. And so here I'm showing you results of our recently completed statewide survey where we asked people which area of the state budget would they most like to most like to protect from cuts. And we've asked this question repeatedly across time, and generally the pattern here is almost always the same. K-12 education is by far and away the area that people identify as most important to them with respect to the budget. And then higher ed, health and human services are somewhat similar, prisons down near the bottom. These responses don't differ very much, you'll see, based on ethnicity. Latinos and whites largely agree that these are kind of the key areas and issues for them. But then when we ask people what they want to do within these areas, or when we ask them what their general view is on taxes and services, we see a very, very sharp divide in California between, for example, our large and growing Latino population and the white population. I focus on those two groups because in our survey, those are the groups where we have the largest sample sizes and the most robust certainty with respect to these responses. And here you'll see that Latinos are much more likely to favor higher taxes and more services, and whites are slightly more likely to favor lower taxes and fewer services. So these demographic changes that we've been talking about here are very important in terms of thinking about our state and where it's headed. Certainly I've just kind of tipped the ice, or hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of the complexity of these changes and some of the meanings they have for public policy. But I think, when I look at California as a lifelong Californian, I think our state's really well known for the beautiful geography and the diversity of our geography, and rightly so, and from the valley and agriculture and all that we have to offer, the mountains, the coast. Our population is maybe not as regarded as another kind of key strength of our state, but it clearly is, and we see this in so many different ways that I wasn't able to touch on here. But the diversity of our state's population and the richness of all the different stories that exist at the local level in California because of our population are really tremendous, and the global connections we have as a state because of our population are also, I think, astounding. So I hope I've been able to share some of that with you. I know we have some time for questions right now, so I'd like to open it up to any questions.